to Everyday Anarchism, dear listener and dear guest. My guest today is Ruth Kinna, still the record holder for most times on Everyday Anarchism. And she is back today to talk about News from Nowhere, which we discussed in our episode about William Morris. And we had planned on, I can admit to the listeners, I had planned on discussing it in that episode. But I think we spent so much time really talking about Morris's relationship to the movement of anarchism that we decided it was best to put aside this anarchy, as you've described it, or as Kropotkin has described it. So in the first episode, we get Morris's political views, his journey, where he fits in this movement. And today we will get his anarchy, his utopia, news from nowhere. And again, I'll say it's generally understood to be in some ways, if not a response, at least in relationship with this work by Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward, which is this progressive technocratic world in which all of your needs are seen to by a sort of unseen machinery that no one has any fear or want or hunger or any of those things, because industrial society has solved the problem of production and distribution. And so we can start right there and say News from Nowhere is not that. It does not seem to have this centralized solution, this dream of the planner at all. It's something entirely different. So maybe we can talk about the composition of it, but I thought we'd just jump right in and just tell the listener what's this world like.
Yeah. So this is an imaginary place that Morris has woken up in. And he's in 1890 and he wakes up sometime in the 20th or 21st century. I can't remember exactly when, but it's a long time in the future, and it's after the revolution. But he's still in London. And the joy of the book in the opening sections, I think, is his description of how he wakes up and has to rub his eyes, because the Hammersmith Bridge, which is where he lived in London, and which actually was quite a revolutionary bridge when it was built at its time, but Morris thought was completely hideous, and is a sort of like a symbol of Victorian engineering and technological advancement. He wakes up and he's delighted to see that it's disappeared, and in its place is this fantastic stone bridge, and that's how that you're kind of taken into this world where, as you say, I mean, there's absolutely nothing technocratic about it. If anything, it's a book which describes how we can, I guess, rediscover our love of making things, our love of production, and live in a world that he would describe as one of well-being and riches rather than profit and wealth. And I think that's kind of one of the main themes of the book. And then it takes us into a description of how this world operates, how the exchange relations are regulated by human interactions, how there is no government, and how they arrived there. I think that's kind of the main ground of the book.
Okay, wonderful. So something that, again, I feel like we didn't quite cover enough in our last episode. So I guess we can have another Morris episode in 2024 if we can imagine, unless the revolution comes before, and then we don't need such a thing. I don't think we discussed the Middle Ages enough. And there's a sense for me that this is, Bellamy's book is called Looking Backward. And the idea is that we've sort of pushed through the growing pains of industrial civilization and come out on the other side, really, and this is an idea associated with John Dewey, among others, that our politics and our social arrangements have caught up with our economic and industrial arrangements in the 19th century. This is Dewey's description of the problem. We have reorganized our economic life, but we do not have a politics and a society that matches that.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what Morris thinks needs to happen. We do not need to reorganize our life to match up with industrial society. It is not that
No.
humanity has fallen behind technology. It is that technology and profit, which, I mean, you could describe capitalism as a form of technology or an organizing principle of technology, has left behind humanity. And he looks backwards. Bellamy's book is called Looking Backwards, meaning to the bad old days of the late 19th century.
Yeah.
Morris is looking to a future that in some ways resembles the past.
That's right. And Morris, I think, is quite explicit about that in his political writings, as well as in this utopia. So, I mean, if you use the framing, which he does at one point, that was adopted by Marxists at the time, by the Social Democrats at the time, they were thinking about the transition of capitalism to socialism, that capitalism would provide the foundations for socialism in the sense that modernization and industrial technological change had provided the basis for well-being for all. And the problem was distribution and the power arrangements, which made it impossible for the mass of the people to enjoy actually the rewards of that economic system. And so they talked about entering into, moving from capitalism to socialism, socialism being a launch pad then for what they call communism. So the first part of the transition would be one where we would collectivize all of our possessions, our land, our industry, and use it in order to enable people to have equal distribution on the basis of their work or their labor. And then in the future, we would evolve to a point where we would be able to perfect those systems and distribute on the basis of need. And Morris looks at this and he says, that's not good enough for me. That's not enough, because what I want is a transformation in our modes of production. I don't want socialism just to be the management of an industrial and capitalist system. And he thinks of those things as connected but separate, I think. I don't want socialism just to be the management of that system. I want it to be a complete transformation. We have to change the way in which we work. We have to find ways of producing without, as if, well, not as if we didn't ever have industrialization, but as if we could remedy all of the ills that industrialization has brought us, one of which is capitalism, but also separate from that is the destruction of our natural environments and the social arrangements that go along with that.
Excellent. So I'm so glad we got to both of these things, which is the natural environment and the social arrangements around them. I mean, Kropotkin certainly states this over and over again. I would say overstates this in the book Mutual Aid, but that human systems of living together work pretty well. Naturally, they stem from evolution, and this is, I find, quite beautifully Morris's expression of how that could be. And it's clear that he views governmental systems as disrupting sort of the natural human feelings of community and working together in the same way that industrial systems destroy the natural environment. And in the same way, the justification for these things is the betterment of humanity. We must implement these systems to prevent these bad things from happening. And Morris wants to turn it around and blame these systems for the unhappiness of life.
I think that's right. And I think he thinks, when he looks at political systems in particular, I think he thinks that they embody for him a kind of an individualist spirit, which is a spirit of self-advancement and I mean, exploitation, not in an economic sense, but in a way of, boosting our prestige, boosting our advantages, competing with each other for honor and for self-advancement. And politics for him is the dirtiest word, actually. Although he's involved in politics, his view of institutional politics is quite different from the way in which he sees collective actions operating, or direct actions, or community projects. He sees these as being not political, because for him, politics is this institutional framework which breeds division, and which is designed actually to use power to the detriment of most people. So he wants systems that are going to, as you say, to build community, to enable everybody to flourish, not on the basis of just having a kind of everybody has to accept that there's a common good. I mean, he is very liberal in his socialism. So he thinks that what is the common good comes from everybody realizing their individual ends, but they only do that in a collective, in a cooperative environment, one which enables them to tap into their creativity, to enable their talents to find their own path.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to bring in David Graeber now. His idea of bullshit jobs, which is what most people are doing. Graeber says in the late 20th or early 21st century is in fact worthless or even counterproductive. The way I like to think of this is we're told that a fantasy like News from Nowhere wouldn't work because it's just too expensive. There's not enough resources for everyone to have food or shelter if we don't have these factories that are producing this food and shelter. And Morris, in so many ways, Graeber is influenced by Kropotkin and Morris. Graeber's arguing that, in fact, most of the work that people do takes food and shelter and adds nothing to it. And the reason why we have to have factories producing our food is because we've got people eating food and adding nothing. Or Graeber argues, taking away from society. So if you're most forms of professionalism, if you're an accountant or a lawyer, you are consuming food, but you are not giving anything back materially. And then the people who are actually producing your food or your resources are miserable, and they are miserable at your behalf, and then on your behalf. And then you state as a professional, well, it just has to be this way. Morris suggests that those lawyers and accountants would actually be much happier farming or making pottery or something like that. And it's a world in which virtually everyone is an artisan. And I'm sure the economists would say the math doesn't check out, but Graeber says actually the math shows that lawyers and other forms of professionals take up tons of resources, and for the most part they do it in the name of corporate capitalism, which doesn't add anything to the world. So it's this world in which you can walk down the street and everyone is surrounded. I mean, he goes shopping and they don't really know why it's called shopping. It's like, oh yeah, shopping is what it's called when you go around and get things that you like. We're not really quite sure. That's just what it was called back in the day. And every time he sees something beautiful, he thinks, well, I can't afford this. And the people around him are like, what do you mean afford? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. There's plenty of time and labor to surround all of us with beautiful things, because we've stopped forcing people to do anything they don't want to do. But we've also stopped allowing people to do things that have no, or I mean, I shouldn't say allowing. We stopped forcing people to do things that have no real virtue, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So we don't produce commodities anymore. We produce things for use, and we fashion those things largely by our own skill and talent. So, and we're bestowing love on the things that we produce because we're doing it in order to, I mean, not only to show off what skills and talents we have, but also because we love our fellow creatures, and we want to ensure that if they have something that we produce, they love it because they need to cherish it, because there's only so much you can produce, and it's far less than what capitalism will produce. So these things have to last. So you have less, you produce you take more time to produce, but you're not producing commodities, you're producing essentially gifts. I mean, one of the first things that happens in the book is when he meets Dick, and Dick gives him a pipe and tobacco. And Morris tries to give him money for this. So Dick's one of the characters in the book, and Dick looks at him and sort of says, well, why would you give me anything for this? This is a pipe. This is for you. I made it. This is for you. And that's how the economy works. So, in terms of its macro implications, it doesn't add up in any kind of contemporary economics for any kind of contemporary mainstream economist, of course, because it doesn't pay for itself, because it's not designed to produce profit. It's also a much more autarkic system. So people are producing for their local needs. We don't have, Morris was already deeply concerned about the way in which trade was being globalized and the implications for that, as indeed was Kropotkin. So what they're trying to do is to think of what it is that you need to exchange in order to enable your lives to be enriched. You're not thinking about what it is you need to produce in order to sell on the market such that you can get money and then go and buy some stuff. You're also not thinking about, a huge amount of Morris's criticism of capitalism is that we produce mass shoddy wares, which are supposed to be disposed of. They're not supposed to last. And so we're continually exploiting resources to produce tat. And he says, if you can't, in the long term, and of course he's right, you can't sustain an economy on that basis. And the problems of it are even worse when you think about, which he does from the point of view of British imperialism, when you think about the costs of that system across the globe in terms of the exploitation of colonized peoples. So the whole system is corrupt, and that's partly what he's trying to overcome. And as you say, he also thinks about the utter waste that there is in the bureaucracy, and that he gets, I think, really from or one of the people he likes. He talks about is Charles Fourier, who was writing in the 1840s and is regarded as one of the sort of the utopian socialists. And he has this, I think Morris uses it at one point, that we pay people to dig holes so that we can pay other people to fill them up again. And that's an analogy for the way in which the capitalist system operates.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And I was just struck as you were talking about the problems. Fast fashion has become a relatively common thing for people to discuss, but it's, the problem is we are making stuff for profit, and sort of along the way, some human needs are met, but that does not seem to be, meeting human needs does not seem to be the goal of the system. No,
we're now into an era where there's actually a battle going on with tech manufacturers of tech goods to ensure that you can provide parts and that you give instructions about how to repair. It's not that long ago that actually you could repair your own car, you could rebuild your own hi-fi. We don't have hi-fi anymore, of course, but computers, all of this stuff just goes into landfill. So the idea that you might reuse or repair something is now part of the battleground because we get so used to chucking stuff away. But what about the diets? That's another absolute disaster in terms of human health, in terms of land use, in terms of if you want to feed the world, then the way to do it is not by producing burgers for the West. It's simply not the way.
Yes, and I think Morris got that. I think Morris got that absolutely right. First. And you're precisely right that it's an imperialist project. Hobsbawm has done great work that the textile industry of India was destroyed in order to create British power. It was not destroyed to clothe the world. You don't destroy a textile industry if what you want is to clothe the world. You destroy a textile industry if what you want is power over what is being produced and where and by who.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm struck. Yeah. So we're recording this in 2022, although I'm planning to release this in 2023. But you and I, Ruth, are living through this moment of high inflation. Hopefully, dear listener, you remember the middle of 2022 as the peak of the inflationary moment. We'll see what happens. But there were these two economists in the US, both affiliated with Harvard, one named Larry Summers, also both affiliated with the Obama administration, one named Larry Summers, the other one named Jason Furman. And they both came out with their predictions of how many months of unemployment we needed in the United States to get inflation under control. So this is the macroeconomic answer. It's like, so we've got a problem, which is inflation is too high. And what we need is for people to not be doing work so that they, struggle to get by, and that will eventually get the problem under control. So when you say that this doesn't make sense from a macroeconomic standpoint, of course it doesn't. But from where I'm sitting, macroeconomics has ceased to make sense.
Makes sense, yeah.
So Morris has multiple times, well, not Morris in the book. I'm blanking on the name right now. The name, is it Will? No, of course it's not William. The old man he meets who tells him about
Old Hammond.
Old Hammond. So Old Hammond is a character we need to introduce. He's not old enough to remember all of the events of the revolution, but he's old enough to remember when things were different, and he has an interest in history. So he knows the events of the revolution. And Old Hammond says over and over again, the goal of the old system was to produce as much as possible while giving labor the smallest amount of payment, not using the least amount of labor, because they would be happy to use a huge amount of labor, but giving labor the smallest share of the pie. So when I read Harvard economists say, well, we've got a problem, it's called high inflation, and the solution is to fire people, and I hear precisely Old Hammond's complaint. The goal of macroeconomics is to reduce the amount of money that goes to the people who are producing the things.
Yeah,
and
that's
I can't see that Morris got that wrong.
No. And he calls it wage slavery, and he means it. Mm-hmm. That's not just rhetoric. He thinks that it is a system of enslavement, and that the people who are dependent on the crumbs, basically, that the capitalist system will give them, are not only being, are not only forced to do the work that they do, but they get absolutely no joy out of it, and it kills them when they're young. I mean, that's the other thing. I recently went to the potteries where Morris had. This is in Staffordshire, so this is in the West Midlands, basically. And it's the area where Wedgwood set up, and where all of the pottery was made in the UK. And Morris had he did some work up there before for part of the stuff he did with the firm. But I found out, at one point they had something like 2,000 factories, 2,000 chimneys burning there, and the average life expectancy was 47. Something like half of the children who were born there died before the age of 5. So that's how poor conditions were for the working classes, and that's the kind of condition that he sees when he's writing News from Nowhere. So when you read News from Nowhere, it's worth also reading, Engels' description of Manchester workshops. It's worth bearing in mind how much a reversal this book is supposed to be. This is painting a picture of an entirely different, better world, and he means it. He thinks it's possible. We just lack the will to bring it into being. That's kind of part of the message, I think.
And I think, something for me that, I have this conversation with my students all the time. I don't think that things have changed much from the situation you're describing. It's just that we've moved those circumstances to other countries. Yep. So I'm in the US, you're in the UK. We have a sense that, people are no longer working under these conditions. And if you ask economists, why don't we just build things in the United States or the UK? And they'll say, well, the labor is too expensive, by which they mean they can't force people to work in those conditions anymore. So your glorious progress, dear listener, if you are in one of these modern, industrial, humane countries where children are not allowed to work, well, you're still allowed to buy garments made by children, whose life expectancy has been destroyed. So the numbers still are not adding up. If you think the industrial technocratic system has worked because we don't have child labor anymore, it's really more that the child labor has been moved outside of your national boundary, and that's not good enough for me.
No,
certainly.
that's right. And and I think one of the other the very strong kind of themes that you get in the conversation between old Hammond and Morris is that there's no middle ground here. There's no reform. You do have to utterly transform the system, and you do it by transforming labor through art. Until you enable people to produce what they want to produce and use their creativity to do it, then we're not going to get anywhere. That's Morris's bottom line, I think.
That's why I find Graeber's bullshit jobs idea so worthwhile, because people say, oh, well, but you can't just let people do whatever they want to do because they will not contribute to society. And Graeber says, well, a corporate lawyer does not contribute to society. So in fact, we have many, many people not contributing to society right now. And Morris and Graeber both argue that if you leave people alone, they will contribute to society. They will maybe write poetry or make music, or maybe they will grow tomatoes, or maybe they will make plates, or maybe they will care for children. And the world we have now, in which harried professionals are busy in their offices while other people, often the people themselves, are imported from the same places where child labor exists, care for their children. Morris would say, you're telling me this is the system that makes sense economically, the system in which someone has to travel from the Philippines to watch your children so that you can do a job which only exists to exploit the people in the Philippines. Wouldn't it be simpler? People say this is a fantasy, but I think it's hard-nosed. Wouldn't it be simpler if you just tried to grow some food and you and your neighbors shared the task of caring for your children? That seems to me actually much more pragmatic. We're told this is a silly utopian idea.
No, I agree. And it's interesting, isn't it? The whole concept of the free rider, and how that plays out in order to show that we can't cooperate, or that the risks are so high. And yet we work, as you say, in a system which enables a lot of people actually to opt out of any meaningful work and reap huge rewards from doing so. And Morris sort of counters the objection of the free rider in the book, and basically the answer is that where you have this special mixture, I guess, of voluntarism and community, then actually it's very rare for someone to say, I'm not going to do this, I'm simply going to live off your labor. It may be that someone's decided today, I don't want to do it, but most of the time, actually, people feel that there is some kind of duty that they have to other people in order not only to look after themselves, but to make sure that other people are also being looked after. That it's a reciprocal relationship, and that's how it works.
Yeah, this brings us back to human nature. So the Star Trek solution to this problem is that human nature has changed. By the time we get to the 80s and 90s version of Star Trek, The Next Generation, virtually every individual that we see, at least, strives at all time to take a long view and do what's best for humanity. They are all calculating technocrats for good. And I think this is an analysis from this guy named Manu Sadia, and I think this is absolutely right. Like, to create a technocratic world, we need every single human being to be a technocrat. And at some point, they will get rid of the factories because they will see that the factories are actually problematic from a resource allocation standpoint, or something like that. And if you want a world without bosses and without this kind of coercion, exploitation, wage slavery, you're indulging in a fantasy of human nature, according to the advocates for it. And Morris, again, turns that around and says, no, someone says in the book, I think Morris says, well, what's the reward for labor? And someone says the reward for labor is life. Like,
That's right.
you get
Yeah,
to live and eat. But of course, as you just said, beyond life, it is community,
yeah,
it is compassion, it is joy.
yeah,
That's so human nature as it exists is primed for those things, and an
yeah.
artisanal production system works with those things.
Exactly right. So he has, I mean, he often talks, he talks, one of the words that Morris likes using is necessity. So there's a necessity that we have to deal with in the world in thinking about our humanity, and our necessity is that we have to work in order to live. And I guess that has a kind of a religious connotation too. But Morris says no, this is just a fact. If you don't work, you don't live. So the question then is, how do you organize, or how do you organize your social life? What arrangements can you make? How can you change your environments in order to make that necessity appear as if it's not a necessity anymore? Because once you can enjoy doing what you have to do, it appears as if it's a pleasurable thing. And News from Nowhere tells us that we can pretty much reduce our consciousness of necessity. We can't get rid of the necessity, but we can reduce our consciousness of the necessity by changing our modes of production. But in order to do that, we have to change our environment such that we are brought into community with other people. So, I mean, and I think Kropotkin's argument is this too. You don't change human nature. You don't change people's moral outlooks. What you do is you change their conditions, and you bring out the best in them, and you enable them to build relationships which are based on trust, but which also allow for failure. So one of the things that Morris talks about in the book is that, people do have intimate relationships. They don't always work out. So how can the community support people who fall out of love, do so amicably, take care of their children? How can we arrange this so that people aren't at each other's throats and competing over possession of the commodity of their children, which is pretty much how our contemporary societies work. So he does allow for relationships to fail. What he's trying to say is that we can just deal with these things differently. But if you're going to do that, you need time and you need trust to do so.
And again, it's the legal apparatus and the commodification of life that create the problem that the legal apparatus claims to solve. Something Ian Forrest says is that when the legal apparatus is being developed and the state apparatus is being developed by someone like Henry VIII, it's not being developed in order to create democratic socialism. And so they very much knew what the point of that legal apparatus was. It was to keep people in power. And then a liberal or a state socialist would say, aha, we can use these mechanisms to solve the problems of divorce. And Morris is saying, well, the problem of people falling out with one another that have children is a necessity. He's not going to create a fantasy that prevents that. But in fact, the solution lies within humanity as well. Finding a solution to this is also a human necessity. And the apparatus that was created to say, take the Catholic Church's wealth and give it to the monarchy of England is not the correct apparatus to adjudicate family life. It's a mistake you have made when you turn to the state for a solution to these problems.
I think he is a sort of an intuitive direct activist in the sense that he will always default to a position where he thinks that it's better for people to resolve their own problems rather than devolve them to somebody else. So in that sense, he is sort of naturally anarchistic. He wants people to make their own decisions. I mean, you could call it liberal. I mean, it is an old-fashioned liberal notion that people are the best judges of their own interests, and basically, I think Morris pushes that idea and says, so how do we make that work? so that we take the aggressive sting out of it, so that we take the competition out of it. But he does, yeah, as you say, he wants people to resolve their own differences. He doesn't want to pretend that they don't exist.
I must admit, and this, I don't need to go on about this, has come up in many podcasts. This is a huge sticking point for people on the left, at least in the United States, because at least going back to Lincoln and the Civil War, the federal bureaucracy is seen as something that can be used to bring freedom and justice and liberty to all. So, I mean, one of the most obvious examples is the system that takes children away from their parents in the name of the good, for the good of the children. It is very difficult, in my experience, in my lived experience, to talk to an American leftist and say, well, I don't know what to do about these children. We've got to figure it out. But I'm skeptical that a bureaucrat with a spreadsheet is the answer to this solution. I read a wonderful essay where someone pointed out that your children can, part of the spreadsheet that gets your children taken away from you can be dirty dishes in the sink. And if you are if you are a wealthy professional, you can have dirty dishes in the sink and the state won't do anything about it. So convincing American leftists that there is a way, we can figure out ways to deal with these problems and help people, but state bureaucracy is not it. Those conversations don't go well, in my experience.
No, but and there's it's very easy, I suppose, to point to the examples where children have been left in environments where they have been abused, neglected, killed. But actually, that's often because they haven't been taken away by the bureaucracies. So the bureaucracies are never very good at identifying these problems, or because they've been given over to other authorities, often the church, who then systematically abuse the children. And the other problem is, with the sort of the idea of the benevolent judge is that, as you say, it's what are the criteria to decide when to decide a child's best interests? Because if you say, well, actually, we have to take children away from single mothers. Absolutely. That's gone on in this country for most of the post-war period.
Two men cannot have children. I mean, a big breakthrough that what finally got gay marriage passed in the United States. Well, I mean, passed. It was legally ruled legal by the Supreme Court. Was all sorts of research that showed that a family with two fathers was, whatever you want to put it, just as good for the children as a family with a mother and a father. And if that's the solution to the problem, is social scientists judging queer parents until they are deemed acceptable, this cannot be, to me at least, the road we want to go down.
Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. And if it's one thing to ask someone to arbitrate for you in a particular dispute because you think that that's going to enable you to resolve the conflict, and another thing to say we must have an arbiter who's permanent and fixed and who will always decide neutrally, because that, I think Morris would argue, is a fiction. They're never neutral, and as soon as you make someone permanent and fixed, then you're going to be basically entrenching a system of power which is ultimately destructive.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note here, I mean, I don't recall that child abuse comes up in this novel, but a murder or a homicide, we should say, does happen. It is based on, on sex, on desire. Morris is not, I'm going to compare this to Star Trek again. This would be an unthinkable thing happening in the universe of Star Trek. No one has passions in Star Trek that they cannot contain, or occasionally they do, and it's revealed that they are under mind control, or they are a clone, or something like that. Morris is asking us to believe in a world in which crimes of passion still exist, but the juridical apparatus does not exist. And everyone's very worried that the murderer, or the killer, I should say, because it's not clear it's murder in that sense. It's a crime of passion. It seems to have been in self-defense, and everyone's worried that he is going to commit suicide And
Yeah.
that's the danger. And they all think, oh, well, that would be very bad. But no one suggests putting him in a straitjacket.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And again, having spent decades of my life as a left liberal, there's even a part of me that rebels against this. Shouldn't there be someone in charge who takes care of this? And precisely for the reasons you've just outlined, I don't think that's right. But Morris is certainly rowing against the tide in the idea that you can create a utopia when this sort of thing still happens, and then it is a personal and indeed a community tragedy, but
Yeah.
not something that requires an outside authority to deal with.
That's right. And that's right. I mean, I think, one could sort of perhaps push Morris a bit and say, again, it's his kind of notion of necessity, in the sense that his view is that you're never going to get rid of the jealousies and rivalries that come into personal relationships, into intimate relationships. But I think I think his answer would be the same thing, that we could say, perhaps you're never going to have a society where you don't have someone coveting somebody else's goods. I mean, he says in News from Nowhere that doesn't happen, but the solution would be the same for him. And again, as you say, although you don't have a case of a child being hurt in News from Nowhere, you do have a divorce, or the equivalent of a divorce, and the same response comes back, that this is not just a problem for the two parents. It's a community problem. We have to take some interest, not interfere, but we have to take some interest to ensure that everybody in this relationship is supported and cared for. And I think that's his starting point. It's about care and support rather than punishment and revenge.
Yeah, Rachel Carson says that, one of the worst things that can happen is you can look at an environmental problem and think, oh, I'm sure the government will take care of this. And it seems to me the same. I mean, if we're thinking about children who are being harmed, or even a parent who cannot get to all of their dishes, his or her dishes, speaking as a stay-at-home parent who could not get to the dishes, it would take a society based on exploitation, based on competition, to not have people reach out and help, to find the right place for that child, or simply to help out with the dishes. It's that is the product of a capitalistic, it's almost an ideology. And then the state becomes the solution to this set of problems that were in fact created by this, not necessarily by the state, but by the same set of